Yeah, so my name is Charles Martineau. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto at the Rotman School of Business. So the title of my paper is Shaping Expectation and Coordinating Attention, the Unintended Consequences of FOMC Press Conferences. Yeah, so the brief summary of the paper is from 2011, the Federal Reserve decided to introduce press conferences following FOMC announcement statements. So 8 times a year, the Federal Reserve announces their monetary policy decisions. Usually since 1994 to 2011, this only occurred via a written statement. But from 2011 onwards, 4 out of those 8 FOMC announcements, the written statement is followed by a press conference by the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve. And I first started initiating this project, then turned to 2 of my co-authors to join me along to understand how this press conferences can have an impact on managing expectations of investors as to when to anticipate an important monetary policy decisions by the Federal Reserve. The main results of the paper that we show is that when an FOMC announcement has a press conference, which the press conference schedule is known in advance, about 6 months in advance before the annual cycle begins. We find in the data that investors anticipate only important decisions by the Federal Reserve to occur on days or on FOMC announcement days for which there is a scheduled press conference. So for example, we find that in the days leading to an FOMC announcement with a press conference, there's more attention of investors about monetary policy decisions leading up on the day of the FOMC announcements. And on days when there's no press conference, we see a decrease in attention. Another important finding of a paper is using the Fed Fund futures contracts. We find that investors anticipate only a high likelihood of an increase of a change in interest rates on days for which there's an FOMC press conferences. These results are important because the Federal Reserve has an objective to manage the expectations of investors. And for a long time when these press conferences were introduced, Janet Yellen was for a long time the chairman of the board, said that investors should treat all FOMC announcements as equal. It's not because one has a press conference and the one without a press conference should be different, but in fact investors saw them as very different. And we make an argument in the paper that this makes it difficult for the Federal Reserve to manage the investor's expectation, which is a large role of the Federal Reserve. And starting since 2018, we believe that the Federal Reserve have taken our consideration results seriously because since in June of 2018, the chairman of the board, now Jerome Powell, has announced that starting in January, they will have press conferences after each meetings. So the way we've analyzed the data of the paper for our empirical analysis is that, for example, for the investor attention, so how people pay attention to monetary policy decisions, we construct 5 different indices of investor attentions coming from 5 different sources. One being the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, for which we count the number of articles that contain the word monetary policy decision or Federal Reserve in the days leading to the FOMC announcements. We also look at Google Trends, so how many times people search monetary policy or more specifically the Federal Reserve in Google. We've also looked at the number of articles in the Bloomberg terminals that concern the Federal Reserve, as well as the number of articles in intraday newswires such as Dow Jones to construct our 5 measures of attention. So this is what we use to understand how attention changes from meeting to meetings with and without a press conferences. This is our analysis that we've done empirically that we think is ex ante before an FOMC decision, but we also look at analysis that is ex post. So we use intraday data, stock returns, and intraday VIX to look at the time of FOMC announcements, how the market react differently with and without FOMC with and without scheduled press conferences. So what I found very interesting when I initiated this project is, in fact, I did not think about making a paper on FOMC with and without press conferences. This result came unexpectedly. Initially, this was a project to understand how FOMC announcement news gets incorporated into stock prices. And I had data, I started with a data set starting unexpectedly from 2011, and I found this strange pattern of how returns following a FOMC announcement was changing from positive, zero, positive, zero, positive, zero. And I saw this trend that was going up, down, up, down, up, down. And I said, what's so different from an FOMC announcement going, because back then I did not know if there was a press conference or not. And as by looking at the FOMC announcement schedule, I realized there was a little star. And these little stars indicated there were some FOMC announcements with a press conference and some without a press conference. And then I said, okay, maybe there's something going on with those press conferences. And this is how I began the project. A potential future project that can be initiated following our paper, this will take a couple of years because we need more data, we need more FOMC announcements, but since January 2018, with all FOMC announcements with a press conference, it would be interesting to see whether this pattern of when investors anticipate an important monetary policy decision, using, for example, the Fed fund rate, the probability of a change in interest rate using Fed fund futures, if this pattern that we saw from 2011 to 2018 going up, down, became flat. But for that, we'll have to wait for more data, or more data coming in coming years. So the reason why we decided to send our paper to JFQA is because we knew early on from the early stage of the project that one of the editors of the JFQA was always interested in our paper. And we felt that our paper was potentially a risky paper for some other journals, but we know that the JFQA is not afraid to take risk on some papers that some other journals will turn their backs on, and that we're really happy that JFQA decided to publish our paper.